Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Colvin, and I am the Public Programs Curator at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Thank you for joining us for our Food for Thought. Before we begin our presentation, I have a few announcements I want to share. First, I'd like to invite you to join us at noon on Thursday, November 12th, for a special panel to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Archives building. You will learn about the campaign to get the building, how its dedication as a World War memorial fits into the larger story of the Great War memorialization, and about Silicaga marble, which is used throughout the archives. Next, I'd like to invite you back for next month's Food for Thought. On Thursday, November 19th, Jim Knowles will be presenting Alabamians in West Point's remarkable class of 1944. Lastly, today's presentation is based on Dr. Dorr's book, 1,000 Thirsty Beaches, Smuggling Alcohol from Cuba to the South During Prohibition. This book, along with so many other amazing products, is available today in our new online store. And we're going to provide a link for that and a discount code to be used on October 15th in order to get 10% off your entire purchase. So be sure to check out the store after the presentation. Today, I am very excited to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Lisa Dorr. Dr. Dorr is a professor of history and associate dean at the University of Alabama. Her research focuses on the 20th century South, especially areas where behavior does not match prescribed norms. She is the co-editor of Alabama Women, Their Lives and Times, which is also available in our online store. And as I already mentioned, 1,000 Thirsty Beaches. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dorr. Welcome.
Hello, and thank you all for this wonderful opportunity to talk to you. I am sorry we're doing it via recording, but as I always tell my students, there are reasons I became a historian, and technology is one of them. So it doesn't always surprise me when it doesn't work. Nevertheless, I'm delighted to be here and talk with you a little bit about my book. All right, I thought I would start this program by telling you a little bit about how this book came about. As you heard, I'm a historian of the 20th century South. And when I was doing research for a previous book, I used a lot of court records, and I traveled to courthouses around the state of Virginia. And over the course of that, I noticed that there were thousands upon thousands of cases of involving prohibition that came before the courts. And so when I was looking for a new book topic, I thought I would write about prohibition in the South because I thought there was a lot that could be said. Things changed, however, when I traveled with the University of Alabama to Cuba in 2006 as part of the College of Arts and Sciences Cuba initiative, which is still continuing. And while there, we presented a bit about our research and we looked for possible research collaborations, but we also spoke a lot with officials and various scholars. And at one reception, I found myself talking with the official historian of the University of Havana. And I spoke very little Spanish and he spoke very little English, but we managed a conversation in which I described my new research project. And he proceeded to take the cocktail napkin out of my hand and begin to draw a rough map of the northern coast of Cuba and the southern coast of the United States. And he then drew arrows indicating all the various routes by which liquor had traveled from Cuba to the southern coast. Well, immediately, of course, that map changed the direction of my research and resulted in this book, and so here we are. Okay. Now, many of you probably have some images in your head when it comes to prohibition. And many people think of speakeasies or they think of gangsters like Al Capone. It might include flappers and bathtub gin, or the beginnings of NASCAR and moonshiners. And certainly all of this is true, but it usually describes a sort of limited image of prohibition, one that's focused more on northeastern and midwestern cities, except for perhaps those moonshine stills in the southern mountains. So my work is a little different in that it looks specifically at how prohibition was evaded and enforced in the South. And particularly, and I have a map here, along the southern coast from Savannah down around the peninsula of Florida and then over to Galveston. Okay. Now, as you may know, January 16th of 2020 marked the 100th anniversary of the beginnings of Prohibition, when Prohibition went into effect. And as you might have realized, the anniversary has been overshadowed by a few other events that have happened in 2020. Nevertheless, the Prohibition Amendment was ratified in January of 1919, and it stipulated that prohibition would go into effect in a year, presumably to allow liquor companies to figure out some other kind of business that they would do. So January of 1920 marked the beginning of what would end up being a 13-year experiment in trying to force Americans to give up their love of strong drink. And why, you might ask, would people decide to try this? Okay. Well, temperance reform had been one of the most enduring reform efforts in American history. The earliest efforts go back to the beginnings of the 18th or the 19th century. And over the years, a wide range of reformers had believed that they could end a wide variety of social problems by getting rid of alcohol, from poverty and disease to unemployment, wife beating and child neglect. All of it, they believed, just by eliminating alcohol. And so the amendment was an effort to bring that utopia, if you will, into existence. All right. Now, the Volstead Act created the legal structure to enforce the amendment. And that act prohibited the manufacture, sale, possession, and importation of liquor. And you may notice that it doesn't prohibit the consumption of alcohol, and that is true. Instead, it continued to allow various exceptions, whether it was homemade wine that one made in one's home for personal use, or it perhaps was intended to allow Americans to be able to consume whatever remaining stores of alcohol they had without fear of the law. And the amendment's advocates truly believed that once Americans had consumed whatever supplies of liquor they had in their cellars, and once they were no longer sort of coerced to imbibe by the advertising of the liquor industry, Americans would quickly and without too much trouble lose their taste for alcohol. And as you may know, that's really not exactly how things went. Okay. Almost immediately after the 18th Amendment went into effect, there developed an illegal traffic in liquor. Okay. And as you might guess, much of that liquor was smuggled to southern beaches from islands to the south, whether it's Cuba or the Bahamas. And southern beaches had long beckoned to smugglers, all the way back to Blackbeard the pirate, if you will. And the South's long, relatively sparsely settled coastline and its proximity to islands like Cuba and the Bahamas made it an attractive landing point for smugglers. And my research focuses primarily on Cuba, so that's what I'll talk about. Now, many people might assume that the kind of liquor that was coming into the United States from Cuba was rum. We all know about Cuban rum. Okay. But that's not the case. And if you think about it, when Prohibition was ratified and it was on the horizons, European distillers and liquor companies realized that they were on the verge of losing their American market. And of course, they had no interest in losing their American market. And so what they began to do was to ship thousands of cases of liquor to places like Havana, knowing that that liquor was likely to wind up as contraband on America's beaches. Now, remember, shipping liquor out of Cuba was perfectly legal as long as its intended destination was not the United States. Okay. Now, European distillers quickly made money off of this. And as an illustration, just to give you an idea, Scotland shipped 15,000 cases of scotch to Cuba in 1922. In the first 3 months of 1923 alone, Scotland shipped over 46,000 cases of Scotch whiskey to Cuba. And thousands of cases of spirits like White Horse whiskey, Canadian Club, Martell cognac, Hennessy cognac, Gordon's gin, and Cliquot champagne, just to name a few kind of familiar brands, traveled from Europe to Cuba with the expectation that they would then be smuggled to southern beaches. And unsurprisingly then, perhaps, smuggling liquor out of Havana quickly became a big business. It happened almost immediately in 1920, and by 1924, it was a well-established industry. At that point, I think some 45 ships regularly operated out of Havana, not to mention the hundreds of other boats that just came down to Havana for an occasional load. Now, Havana alone supplied the United States with approximately 500,000 cases of illegal alcohol per month. Okay? And that was worth about $80 million a year. but worth $80 million at Havana's wholesale prices, okay? When they smuggled liquor to the United States, it didn't mean that a beautifully undoctored bottle of Hennessy cognac was available to most Americans. Instead, most of that liquor was diluted, colored, reflavored, and rebottled once it arrived in the United States. And just to give you an idea of how those supplies were stretched, in 1926, one bootlegger around Christmas landed 96,000 bottles of high-end liquor in the United States. And he transformed those 96,000 bottles into nearly 750,000 bottles of bootleg booze destined for holiday tables. Okay. Now, as I said, exporting liquor was perfectly legal under Cuban law, as long as the ship's manifest indicated that the liquor was intended for a destination where liquor was legal. Okay. And also, ships were required to return with customs documents that indicated that they had unloaded their liquor at the appropriate port. Okay. Now, liquor wholesalers in Havana were full-service entities to their smuggling operations. They provided not only the product and loading it, even the burlap sacks and straw many rum runners used to repackage liquor into smaller, easier to handle hams. Okay? But they also provided forged custom papers that indicated the liquor had been unloaded at a legal port. Okay? So smuggling ships cleared customs out of Havana with those forged documents already on board. Often they indicated they were heading to Havana, or not to Havana, to Honduras or to Canada. And then once they left the port, they almost immediately turned north for the American coast. Okay. Now, some of that liquor certainly met demand in local markets, places like New Orleans and Tampa, Miami, and Mobile. Some of that liquor headed further up the coast. It might go to Boston or New Jersey or New York City. Some of it, though, landed on southern coasts and made its way north by rail. It might be disguised as barrels of tar or beef tallow. It might be disguised as boxes of tile or crates of fruit. But that liquor then that was landed in the South might make its way to places like St. Louis or to Chicago. Now, and this is an example of some of the whole different kinds of ships that were used for smuggling. It might be anything from a sailing boat with multiple masts. It might be a motorboat. It might be some of these motorized ships and boats of various varieties. Pretty much anything could get in the game. And these were the kinds of ships that were taking liquor to the north. All right. Now, since this is a talk sponsored by the Alabama Department of Archives and History, I want to describe how this traffic might work with a sort of local example. And I want to talk a little bit about Mobile. Now, Mobile was perfectly situated to support a thriving liquor operation. It was on the Gulf Coast. Mobilians enjoyed their good times. And it was also close to rivers and railroads that headed inland. And so boatloads of liquor landed on the shores in and around Mobile Bay. They might be stored in the barns or the swamps located in the area. And then either road or railroads transported that liquor in Mobile to New Orleans or Tampa, or even as far north as Birmingham or on to Chicago and other parts of the Northeast. Now, in 1923, Mobile had one of the largest conspiracy trials of a liquor syndicate. And agents had descended and arrested more than 70 local men, including, and this is sort of eye-popping, a state representative, a former sheriff, several local deputies, a local attorney, and a wealthy businessman, and captured more than 10,000 quarts of liquor. Now, the case alleged that the men operated essentially a liquor wholesaling business that stretched from Cuba to the liquor markets in Chicago. And at least once a month, members of the organization traveled to a fleet of schooners that were anchored outside of Mobile Bay and returned with some 1,000 cases of imported liquor. Now, some of that liquor, again, was packed in barrels labeled as turpentine and put on the railroad for Chicago. But the rest supplied local liquor retailers who paid protection money to the local operation. Now, business was brisk, and it increased so rapidly that the demands for liquor soon exceeded the amount of available liquor supply. Okay. And the operation was, in many ways, a model of organization. It kept very neat accounts at the local bank. It paid monthly protection money to local, state, and even federal officials. And it had clearly identified budget lines for various things they thought the operation would need. They had bribery money for law enforcement. They allocated funds for legal fees in case anybody got in trouble. And realizing that politics was important in maintaining their profitable operation, they also had budget line items for contributing to both local political parties. Okay. Now, this was huge news in the early 20s in Mobile. Unfortunately, hardly any of the men ended up being convicted. Many of them went on to rather illustrious careers in politics. But that operation and the trials that resulted did sort of paint a fairly clear picture of how that operation worked. Now, in a few minutes, I'll talk a little bit more about who was drinking all that alcohol. But first, I want to talk about the federal government's efforts to try and stem the tide. Okay, but first, I want to show you a couple pictures. These are some of the seized liquor during those raids in Mobile. They're really wonderful images. All right. Okay, so how is prohibition going to be enforced? Now, despite the hearty assurances of temperance advocates that enforcing prohibition would be easy, the officials who actually had to do the work realized almost immediately they faced a near impossible task. A customs collector in Tampa, for example, made the difficulties clear to his bosses a full 6 weeks before prohibition even went into effect. Already, he was receiving reports from officials in the Bahamas and Cuba and around Florida that the beginnings of a smuggling trade were already apparent. Dozens of vessels, he heard, were already landing liquor on the coast of Florida as part of the trade. Okay. And as he said, the Customs Service is absolutely helpless to prevent this smuggling. He said, there were only 5 customs officials along the entire east coast of Florida, some 500 miles, and the Coast Guard was little better prepared. When a Cuban official cabled the Coast Guard that a Cuban schooner had left with a load of liquor for Miami, the local Coast Guard officer replied that he didn't have a boat in running condition. And worse, he only had 6 possible members for a crew, and half of them were cooks. Okay. As he said, I am at a loss to know what action to take to stop this illegal traffic. Okay. Now, the Coast Guard was charged with preventing smuggling by sea. And it was a relatively new service. It hadn't been around all that long. They had sort of brought together all the various lifeguard or life-saving stations around the country. And so when prohibition went into effect, the Coast Guard had a fairly paltry fleet of some 30 cutters, some harbor launches, and a few surf boats at those life-saving stations around the country. Now, obviously, this was going to be laughably short of the kind of fleet that the Coast Guard would need to patrol thousands of miles of the American coast. Okay. And this is really the moment at which the Coast Guard, for the first time, gets involved in law enforcement. And it becomes one of its primary missions as a result of prohibition. Okay. And prohibition, no doubt, causes the Coast Guard to grow. Now, the expectation was that the Coast Guard would work very closely with the Customs Bureau and with the Bureau of Prohibition to stem the traffic in illegal liquor. But as you might imagine, things did not go as planned. Okay, one basic problem was bureaucratic inefficiency. It was enormously difficult to get multiple federal agencies to work together. And just to give you one example, here are some of the problems they faced. Now, criminal trials required testimony from Coast Guard officers who had actually seized the boat at sea. Okay, but as you realize, Coast Guard officers were frequently at sea patrolling for other smugglers. Well, in one case in Florida, the problems became very apparent. Now, the federal district court in Jacksonville, Florida, was attempting to try several smugglers for smuggling. Okay. And so the court sent a list of Coast Guard witnesses that they needed to the Bureau of Customs in Tampa. Okay. And they instructed that Customs should make arrangements to have those Coast Guard officers appear in Jacksonville in court. Well, of course, on the day the trial was supposed to begin, the Coast Guard officers were nowhere to be found. And when the court learned, or sort of looked into the matter, they learned that the Customs Bureau had never gotten around to notifying that the Coast Guard officers would be needed for trial. And as a result, they had to dismiss some 10 cases. All right. Now, so there were some certain problems in enforcing prohibition from the get-go. The Coast Guard is way too small. There's tremendous bureaucratic inefficiencies that will be exploited by smugglers. And another was that preventing the importation of alcohol was a pretty complicated task. Okay. It went well beyond just having enough ships out there. All right. So, because from the moment that prohibition went into effect, a debate raged about the extent of American jurisdiction over the high seas. Or more specifically, how far out from shore did America's prohibition laws extend? Now, most nations agreed that every country maintained the right to enforce its laws up to 3 miles out to sea from its coastline at low tide. So, within that 3 mile band of water around the United States, the Coast Guard had every right to board and search vessels suspected of carrying alcohol. Now, smuggling ships, of course, were well aware of that 3 mile limit, and they knew not to travel closer than 3 miles. Otherwise, they were liable to be targeted by the Coast Guard. So they happily lingered just outside that 3 mile limit, okay, and let other boats come to them and transfer liquor to shore. Now, oftentimes at 3 miles out, those floating schooners were visible to shore. And to supporters of prohibition, this was absolutely unacceptable. Now, those rum rows, those floating schooners of ships carrying alcohol that were happy to sell their load to boats that were coming from shore, um, as they were ever more visible off of cities like New York City or New Jersey or Boston or Miami or Mobile, um, essentially that 3 mile limit became the point at which the black market in alcohol could begin. So to deal with that, the Coast Guard tried a number of tactics. First of all, they decided to enforce liquor 12 miles out, okay, or what they estimated to be the distance a smuggling schooner could run at full speed for an hour. So that limit becomes very, very subjective. And they also decide to spend their time kind of harassing suspected smugglers, as these pictures indicate, to make it very difficult for boats to come out from shore and trying to collect alcohol. All right, now for members of the Coast Guard, prohibition enforcement meant long days at sea, harassing suspected smugglers or scouring the horizons for boats that might be involved in smuggling. And I just wanted to give you an example of one ship's experience. Okay, now this was a cutter. It was known as the Signan, and it was based at Key West, and it left its base at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon one time. And at about 7:30 in the evening, it spotted a suspicious vessel. So it immediately changed course. It increased to full speed. The suspected ship also increased to full speed and changed course. So the Coast Guard then fired a blank shot to indicate that it really, really wanted the boat to stop. Well, the boat had no intention of stopping until it ran aground on some shoals. At that point, the Coast Guard was able to send a party over to board the craft and was told by the boat's crew that the boat carried a cargo of gasoline. The Coast Guard men noticed, however, that the hatch to the boat were nailed shut. And after forcing open the hatches, they found a load of 91 cases of cognac and other liquors in the hold. So the Coast Guard then placed the crew under arrest. They towed the schooner back to Key West. They placed the crew in jail, and they delivered the liquor then to the Deputy Collector of Customs. Okay. Now, for many smugglers, they often contested whether they were in waters that gave the Coast Guard jurisdiction, or they might claim that they weren't headed to American ports anyway, that they were only heading to a place where liquor was legal. Regardless, for the next decade or so, Coast Guard ships routinely tracked, boarded, and seized boats that were suspected of engaging in liquor traffic. Okay. And numerous rum runners were boarded and seized and towed to ports like Mobile for trial. Now, Coast Guard authorities and prohibition authorities very much preferred that the Coast Guard would tow boats into Mobile or Savannah because they believed that Mobile and Savannah district courts actually cared about prosecuting smugglers. They believed that the Florida district courts were enormously corrupt. Okay, and at one point, 11 ships were held in Mobile, each with large cargoes of illegal alcohol on board. 4 of those they actually successfully prosecuted, and the ships were sold at auction and the liquor destroyed. But for the other 7, they were released with their cargoes of liquor intact. All right. So who is drinking all of that alcohol? Well, prohibition agents complained that they faced a virtual army of prohibition violators beyond those smugglers we've already talked about. As one of them wrote, we face, quote, the wine drop man, the hip pocket flasker, the drunk in the auto, and the family distiller. Okay. And there is a rare set of records surviving that list the efforts of a number of prohibition agents in Mobile. Now, these agents' efforts largely involved driving around the area and the rural areas to the north of Mobile, searching for suspected liquor dealers and making what were known as test purchases of alcoholic beverages. And if they purchased something that they tasted and proved to be alcohol, then they could arrest the person on charges of selling booze. Okay. And what's interesting about these records is as they list the various places these agents went, is that they show the extent of the booze market or the liquor market in even rural areas around Mobile. Okay. So these liquor agents successfully were able to purchase liquor at residences, at restaurants, at rooming houses. They were able to purchase from hotel bellhops, the proprietors of cafes, gas stations, garages, even produce stands, and liquor and lumber mills and paper mills. Right, so liquor was available virtually anywhere people looked. Okay, and as the ready availability of liquor suggests, many Americans continue to drink despite the law. And just to give you an idea, in Mobile in 1925 alone, 874 people were arrested for public drunkenness, compared to 376 arrests for all other kinds of prohibition offenses. Even officers who were charged with enforcing the law tended to drink fairly regularly. And in many ways, the work of these prohibition agents mapped the landscape of a modernizing South. Okay. Here's just one image of the liquor that's seized from a cafe and a lunchroom. Okay. Now, over the course of the early 20th century, cafes and restaurants, sidewalk stands, and lunchrooms had sprouted around the South. And they were accompanied by things like dance halls and clubs and movie theaters and other locations that offered various kinds of legal and illegal commercial entertainment. Okay. Well, then you add to that the rise of the automobile and roads that enabled people to travel about and also spurred the development of other kinds of businesses like filling stations and garages. All of these things provided an opportunity for an enterprising business owner to add to his bottom line by selling liquor. And the liquor traffic facilitated all of these new forms of consumption and enjoyment. And in many ways, as liquor flowed into the commercial establishments of every kind, they helped the South become a modern consumer economy. All right. Now, supporters of prohibition, in many ways, were horrified by what they saw. Oops, we'll come back to that. An anonymous letter to the governor of Alabama suggested that Mobile authorities were overwhelmed by the crime in their midst. Things had gotten so bad, one person wrote, that, quote, ladies are not safe from insults in town on account of shitty sellers and makers. Not only were blind tigers located in the heart of city, blind tigers were places where you could buy liquor, but the writer reported that, quote, immoral houses are situated in almost every block. Women lying up, not working, and ruining the young generation. The failures of prohibition enforcement in this writer's eyes indicated that alcohol was causing sort of widespread moral decay. All right. Well, the writer may have been onto something, because one thing that is clear is that during Prohibition, the ways that Americans drank changed, and the ways in which Southerners drank changed similarly. Okay. Increasingly, women and men were drinking in public. In Birmingham, for example, arrest records indicated that drinking was the part of a night of entertainment on the town for couples. Over the course of the 1920s, the numbers of women arrested for public drunkenness during the evening hours or even the late wee hours of the morning with a male companion increased significantly. And on college campuses, drinking, dating, and new social activities like necking and petting, they also increased as well. And all of those things went hand in hand. And in fact, these two cartoons that you can see now are actually cartoons that were from the Rammer Jammer or humor magazine published at the University of Alabama. Now, university officials expressed continual dismay about the amount of drinking among their students, certainly as did parents, but reports of even female students drinking continued. And the casual exchange of a recipe for bathtub gin sent to Sarah Mayfield, who is a college student from a prominent Tuscaloosa family, from one of her male college friends, provides but one example. Okay. Now, this recipe called for 1 pint of, quote, Mr. Al K. Hall, Mr. Alcohol, plus 1 pint of distilled water, 4 to 5 drops of oil of juniper, and 1 tablespoon of glycerin. And it included a note with the assurance, I know there's nothing poisonous in this recipe. Of course, it would depend on what was in the alcohol. All right. Well, by 1930, surveys of law enforcement and the legal system indicated that there was widespread disrespect for the law among the public. Okay. A judge in Galveston described prohibition as a joke, even among citizens who did not drink. And a police chief in Louisiana noted his citizens looked on prohibition as a farce. Well, the district attorney in Apalachicola, Florida, reported that violating the law was, as he said it, practically a national pastime. Americans throughout the country, including the South, gave little thought to violating prohibition laws. One judge on the coast of Mississippi said, quote, 90% of the men who violate no other law, and a large percentage of the women, do not hesitate to violate the Volstead Act. The only exceptions, he noted, were ministers. Right? So drinking and alcohol seeped into all parts of wider culture. And linguists at the time noted the remarkable flowering of language that described things like alcohol or drinking or drunkenness. Okay. And they illustrate the trend. And I'm going to give you a few examples. Whether they were drinking corn juice, giggle water, monkey swill, panther sweat, or just plain something on the hip, Americans and Southerners with them continued to drink or drench the gizzard, go on a bender, on the blink, on a spree, or get 3 sheets to the wind. And so they routinely got drunk, canned, coked, fiddled, jingled, pickled, piffled, slopped, snozzled, or whipsy along the way. Right. Now, unless one had a particularly well-stocked cellar from pre-Prohibition days, however, or made wine at home, obtaining alcohol involved some sort of illegal activity, whether it was buying, selling, transporting, or importing. And plenty of Americans certainly snapped their fingers at the mild penalties of violating prohibition laws. But I suspect there were probably a few who were still a little bit squeamish about out-and-out criminal behavior. And they could satisfy their taste for alcohol without compromising their local reputation by travel. So tourism and alcohol. Well, in the 1920s, really for the first time, Americans across all classes embraced the idea of the vacation. Okay. Now, it was partly because of the development of roads and highways in places like Florida and the South. It certainly had something to do with the ability of more Americans to begin to own cars, which led to the development of what was known as tin can tourism, or traveling by car and camping along the way. But for many roving Northerners, the South had particular appeal. Its romanticized ethos of moonlight and magnolias drew Northerners away from the frenetic pace of industrial life. And certainly the beaches lured many, and there was always the weather. Okay. But the tourist industry provided an infrastructure in which the distribution of alcohol flourished. And whether it was through filling stations and general stores that catered to those tin can tourists, or the swank hotels of Miami and Tampa, providing amenities to tourists almost invariably involved providing them alcohol as well. For example, hotels in Miami Beach openly sold liquor in their dining room, and they weren't shy about offering it to their patrons. One operated an open bar with 5 regularly employed bartenders and 2 waiters and promised every drink known for prohibition. One Ford cop complained that virtually every hotel bellhop was a bartender, eager to locate liquor for guests. And one unusually entrepreneurial gas station along the Dixie Highway in Ocala, Florida, actually brought drinks on trays to tourists in their car as they filled their tanks with gas. All right. So apparently, tourists drank openly and excessively. Though I'm not sure about this woman, but I just love this picture. This was a woman from Baltimore, I believe, who had gone to Florida for vacation. All right. So tourists really embraced the ability to drink while on vacation. Okay. They snapped photos of themselves posing at drink stands on the beach. And this one talks about Havana, Cuba, but this is actually in Miami. Okay. Miami police reported almost 3,500 arrests for drunkenness in 1929 alone, which was far more than any other offense. And then you add to that 930 arrests for drunk driving, and the numbers were enormous. In fact, those arrests represented 70% of the total arrests for the year. Now, alcohol was clearly then, for many people, an expected part of a vacation enjoyment. So much so that smugglers worked hard to make sure that there was an adequate supply on hand when there were big events. For example, in 1928, both the Elks and the Shriners held their conventions in Miami, and so liquor supplies increased accordingly. And in 1925, 10,000 cases of liquor were bought by one Major League Baseball manager for use for 5 teams who were doing spring training in Florida. Okay. And that deal had been arranged with the help of Mr. Ringling of the Ringling Brothers Circus, who also wanted some of the cargo for his guests and his audiences. Now, certainly there were those who probably were a little leery about blatantly violating the law on American soil, but they had options as well. And that was travel to Cuba. Okay. Now, Cuba offered particular attractions. It was very easy to get there from the United States. There was ferry service from New Orleans, Florida, and New York. It was cheap. And the island promised exotic scenery and beautiful weather. So for more intrepid travelers, it also offered things like nightlife and intoxicating pleasures, including of the liquor variety. And this was a famous ad by Bacardi, which was distilled in Cuba, showing that Uncle Sam could come down on Bacardi's bat and enjoy the liquor that wasn't available in the United States. Now, Basil Woon was the author of a kind of witty sort of memoir / guidebook titled When It's Cocktail Time in Cuba. Okay. And he was so focused on the cocktail aspects that his entire first chapter is on where people can go to get a drink. And its title is Where Everyone is Drinking and Not a Soul is Drunk. And only after describing all of Havana's drinking options does he then follow up with a chapter entitled But One Must Eat. Okay. Now, Woon described the favorite drinks in Cuba, the daiquiri, the planter's punch, the presidente. He told how to make them. He mentioned the most fashionable bars, La Florida, and of course, Sloppy Joe's. This is a photo on the left, which is an old picture from the 20s, but on the right is a picture that I took in Cuba probably in 19... Oh, actually, it's not the one that I took, but it is now open and available, and you can go to Sloppy Joe's if you go to Havana. Okay. Now, Sloppy Joe's was owned by a man who used to be the head barman at the Biltmore Hotel in New York, and it did the largest tourist business. It was actually straight up the street from where the ferry ships let off their passengers. It was always filled. It never closed and employed 11 bartenders. Now, Woon even assured nervous travelers that if they overindulged, Cuban police might very well return them to their hotels and tuck them into bed. Now, popular magazines echoed Cuba's alcoholic appeal. As one wrote, unlike dry America, Cuba is hot, it is wet, and it is, in its easy tropical way, wide open. And no surprise then that between 1927 and 1933, when the Depression killed the tourist trade, more than 400,000 Americans made their way to Cuba. Now, many Americans liked what they found, as their postcards back home suggested. And they also indicated some of the reason they were going there. One woman's postcard read, and note the order of things she did. We visited Morro Castle, all churches, clubs, and theaters, tropical gardens, plenty of beer, free if you want it. Now, the Tropical Gardens Brewery was a favorite tourist attraction, and more than a few tourists traveled home with snapshots of themselves holding complimentary mugs of beer. Another tourist highlighted another famous drinking spot. Going out to see Sloppy Joe today, located him yesterday, and then to the brewery, Tropical Gardens. Oh boy. Not surprising then that tourists sometimes got themselves into trouble. In 1927, for example, a businessman from Milwaukee traveled to Havana, and when he failed to return home to work on schedule, his employer wrote the consulate in Havana, inquiring about his whereabouts. Well, the consulate helpfully informed the boss that the man had fallen in the street while he was drunk and been hit by a tram. He wasn't badly hurt, but he remained in the hospital. The employer was either remarkably understanding or not entirely surprised, and it thanked the consulate for the and it looks as if a friend had just one or too many, as would be natural, having gone to Havana. Now, some even sought to bring some of the good entertainments home with them when they returned. There were numerous cases in which tourists attempted to smuggle small amounts of alcohol back into the United States. One member of Congress was stopped because his trunk was leaking, and when it was opened, it was found to contain virtually an entire bar of assorted liquors and spirits of all kinds, and he, of course, claimed that they all belonged to his brother-in-law. And women, too, tried small-scale smuggling as well. One caught the careful eye of the customs agent in Key West when he noticed that her overcoat looked awfully bulky. She was found to be hiding 5 quart bottles of liquor in her coat. All right. Well, that brief foray into smuggling and drinking during Prohibition suggests to me just a few things we might think about. Now, stories like these certainly connect us to our collective past. And they indicate that, perhaps we really aren't all that different from how people were back then. And as we consider their choices, we can maybe gain some insight into the choices that we have to make. And they also remind us of a time when relations between Cuba and the United States were very, very different, and in fact, quite cooperative. The United States quickly found that it could not enforce its own laws without Cuba's help. Now, Cubans, on the other hand, were continually frustrated that the United States was so inept at trying to stop smuggling. But at the same time, whether you talk about smuggling or booze tourism, one is struck by the determination of many Americans to continue to drink despite the law. These cases, I think, highlight the perils of trying to legislate a particular form of morality, a particular vision of how people should behave. Whatever the law, for many Americans, alcohol simply became part of what they saw as modern, sophisticated, but largely harmless entertainment. And they enjoyed it however they could. All right. So at that point, I am finished with mine. I would love to take your questions, and we will do the best we can to answer them.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much, Dr. Dorr. That was a fabulous presentation, very interesting. I learned so much about both prohibition, but also kind of people's roundabout ways of getting around prohibition, which I think is always fun to
Yes.
hear about. This is normally the time that we would be able to take questions from the audience, but since we are recording, we can't. But luckily, to everyone who's watching, Dr. Dorr has given us her email address. I'm going to leave it up here on the screen while she and I talk a little bit. If you have any questions for Dr. Dorr, you can contact her at lisa.dorr@ua.edu. And like I said, it's on the screen. I'm going to go ahead and leave that up for you. But I know I had a couple of questions because as we were going through it, I thought it was just so fascinating to hear about the people who both before with the temperance movement all the way through. And so a few questions that I had. First one, this year's obviously the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, and everyone always takes it back to the temperance movement, right? Like that was one of those political movements that women really got involved in. And that picture you showed was primarily women, but I saw, I think, at least one man there.
Right.
And so I kind of wanted to figure out, were there a lot of men involved in the temperance movement? What were their kind of arguments? Were they the same arguments as women about morality, or did they have kind of a different spin on the argument?
I think certainly there were men involved in the temperance movement, and it is true that women, by getting involved in movements like temperance and all sorts of other reforms for orphanages and all sorts of stuff, realized they come to see that they should have a political role, a larger political role. I think there were certainly many of them who saw the same problems of morality, that drinking they thought was evil. It was, of the very devil in the bottle. But I think also that they believed that there were corruption involved with the liquor interests, as they would see it, whether it infiltrated public life or political life. And so they saw sort of more structural questions as well, I think. Now, I wouldn't say that women didn't notice those. I think many of these women are very, very savvy. They're just having to use their political influence a little bit different than men are. But it was probably the longest running reform effort in the United States.
Definitely. We've been looking, like I said, we've been looking a lot at it this year, and all the way back to Frances Griffin in the 1890s, where we can see she's becoming a suffragist. But for years before that, she was a temperance worker.
Yeah.
And so it was one of those things, seeing how they're kind of closely tied together. I think is very interesting. And then it's also interesting that then after Prohibition, it's a lot of women who are the ones that are, going out and drinking even more.
You're right, right. And now those might be very different women too. I think, certainly in some ways, I think prohibition is sort of seen as the culmination of the progressive movement. It is passed in part because of fears of the women's vote. If they were to get, when they get the vote and are able to vote at the first time, they thought the assumption was that women would vote as a bloc and punish particular industries, particular politicians who supported things like alcohol interests. But yes, but those young college students are different. And in some ways, I think, as I tell my students in class, parents and the older generation are always terrified and anxious that the younger generation is ripping moral norms into shreds. And that it's going to spell the demise of society. And I research students that I have yet to really see that happen. But it is, this generational divide in what is acceptable certainly takes on a larger role here at this moment. And it becomes very, very visible with these new forms of public leisure and entertainment.
Exactly. No, I love that. I also had a question about the kind of conspiracy trial in Mobile, because I find it interesting that this is one of the largest ones that's happening in Mobile, so kind of very local for all intents and purposes for Alabama. And it's a 70-person trial, and then it wasn't able to really follow through. So I wasn't sure, was that kind of evidence-based? They didn't have enough evidence against them? Was it their position in society? Like these were just really well-connected men?
It's hard to tell, and I'm not the sort of real expert on that. There was a wonderful article that was written by Sam Webb in Alabama Heritage on that trial, and specifically on the prosecutor who tries to bring it, and eventually he has to flee the state. And in part, I think there was a lot of, certainly there are issues about how much could you prove that liquor was seized where U.S. had jurisdiction. Or that the liquor that was out there was intended for illegal uses. But I think there were also a fair number of juries that just weren't all that interested in convicting. And so, but that is one of the more interesting cases. And to me, the sort of city-wide organization that's covered all the bases of everything, I think was certainly particularly interesting.
Definitely. And that kind of leads me into another question, because I'm so fascinated with this idea, like the vacation and almost escapism, and even going to Florida is almost like you're leaving, the law behind, right?
Right.
And so, just for these resorts, they're openly handing out liquor. Was there any ramifications for that, or was it just kind of like a don't ask, don't tell, paying under the table corruption?
But
Or was it?
Miami, I mean, there were complaints right all around that Miami and Florida in general just was the worst state for prohibition enforcement anywhere, and that Miami in many ways was wide open. And in fact, the joke was that there's a lot of Coast Guard, there were Coast Guard installations there, and there were routinely allegations that the Coast Guard, they weren't trying to stem smuggling, they were actually just trying to steal the supplies and sell it themselves. And the joke in Miami was that the best liquor was Coast Guard liquor. And so it was sort of corruption through and through, which is why in many cases, prohibition leaders, especially in Washington, really wanted the Coast Guard to take those ships to places like Mobile or Savannah, where they believed a prayer that it would be, that the law would be enforced. But yeah, Miami was just wide open.
It was just kind of like, and that's what I think is interesting, is that you see so many of these coastal cities, like that they all were just, slightly just going against, right? Just in their own way, just kind of like kind of butting against the law.
Yeah.
Where it's smuggling it in Mobile, places like that, sending it out to local areas. Like you said, selling it everywhere from a fruit stand to a lumber mill, which is, you can get it in more places than you can get today.
Right.
And so I think that's it's an interesting story about both this time in U.S. history that we are always trying to wrap our brain around, but also, like you said, kind of this human resistance to trying to force this morality on them, but also it was fun. That's what they wanted to do, and there was always a way around it.
Yeah. And I also point out too that it's a very different image of the South. This is not the sort of sleepy, rural, agricultural story of the South. I mean, in this story, the South pretty much looks like everywhere else. That it is becoming modern, women are behaving the same way, that cars and bars and movies and stuff, this is, for many people, what they looked forward to. So it makes the South just feel entirely different than much of the history around the same time might indicate.
It connects it back to the rest of U.S. history. It connects it and reminds us that the South is not separated from
No.
We are a part of this larger history. And what was happening in New York was happening in Mobile too.
Yeah. In fact, they were working together on it, and with the international places too. Very well connected South.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope everyone enjoyed this amazing presentation. And I also hope that it has inspired you to go and to get 1,000 Thirsty Beaches. It is a wonderful book, and you can learn even more than you learned today from Dr. Dorr's presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Dorr. And I hope to see everybody again next month.
Wonderful. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.